Hello and welcome to the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Peter Xiao for an introduction to the Chinese classics.
So my name is Peter Xiao. I'm currently a second-year PhD student at UCL, University College London, and I'm researching on the reception of Western classics in the Jesuit mission to 16th century China, mainly looking at the works of Matteo Ricci, the most prominent Jesuit missionary in Chinese history. And really thank you to Joseph for giving me the opportunity to talk about Chinese and Western classics and literature today. I'm very excited for this podcast.
Could you start by telling us, what do we mean when we talk about the Chinese classics?
I think there are multiple meanings behind it, but basically, when we define the term classics, no matter that's in the Chinese or Western sense, we mean literary work that have been studied continuously in a civilization. So, if you ask me what does Chinese classics entail, I would say that's the canon of Chinese literature work from the Book of the Odes, Shi Jing, which was around 3,000 years ago, until the classical literature in the Qing dynasty. So a long series of classical literary work that have been studied by Chinese scholars continuously. I would say that's the Chinese classical canon. And given the fact that China, in my opinion, is a continuous civilization, which means a civilization that never ends from the beginning to the present time. So that makes the Chinese classical canon a continuous classical literary culture, which basically means there's connection between different literary periods. It's a continuous development.
Westerners will have an idea of the classics or our own tradition, which would mean the study of Greek and Latin works. How, beyond what you've said about the continuum of cultural tradition, how do you think the Chinese classical tradition differs?
I think a big difference between the Chinese classical canon with the Western classical canon was the Chinese classical canon certainly has a much stronger connection with the ideology of Confucianism. Because given Confucianism's special position, special importance in the civilization of China, it was actually the Confucian scholar who played the important role of transmitting the classical Chinese canon throughout Chinese history. And therefore, you can't really separate Chinese classical canon from Confucianism. Chinese classical canon, in my opinion, was effectively a product of Confucianism. That brings to my next thought, which is because, in my opinion, given the fact that Chinese classical canon has been a continuous development, in the early stages of Chinese classical canon, there were more philosophical texts than literary texts, which means there were more texts related to philosophy, to ethics, as opposed to novel. That certainly came at a much later date. For example, fiction was not really a thing in Chinese classical canon back in the spring and autumn periods or in the Qin and Han dynasty. Fiction appeared in China around the Tang dynasty, for example.
So you would say that the Chinese classics are specifically Confucian works. And what other philosophies are represented there? Are the great works of Taoism part of the Chinese classics in your mind?
Interestingly, the most important text within the Taoist tradition, Dao De Jing or Lao Tzu, the two names for it, Dao De Jing or Lao Tzu, is actually not part of the 4 books and 5 classical canon. When you talk about 4 books and 5 classics, Dao De Jing is not part of the text. But it has been widely studied by Confucian scholar or Chinese scholar from other philosophical school of thought continuously. So I would say it's part of the classical canon, but it's not part of the fundamental classical canon that has a direct relationship with the civil service examination in Chinese history. So let me give you a brief example. A scholar, let's say Ming Dynasty China, like Matteo Ricci's time in China, would definitely read Taoist canon, for example, Dao De Jing, during his educational journey. But since that text was not assessed under the Confucian civil service examination system, the study of the text will not be given the same importance as Confucian canon. So that shows you the difference. It will be read, but not read to such an extent like the Confucian canon, because it was not assessed in the civil service examination system. Yeah.
So to be a canonical Chinese classic, a part of a capital C Chinese classic, you would say it needs to be that's intrinsically bound up with the examination system. Is that
Yes,
right?
because that has been the main feature of the Chinese Confucian education system since Tang Dynasty, which means Confucian education leads you to a pathway in the civil service. And that has been the main
Hmm.
driving force of Chinese society from the Tang Dynasty onwards. So there's a direct connection between the Confucian education system and the civil service examination. And therefore, the examination determine what texts are important and what texts are not that important. Yeah. Certainly by the time of Ming Dynasty, in early modern China, the study of Confucian classical canon was given the paramount importance out of all Chinese classics. Yeah.
And what was Confucius's personal relationship with these works?
Which is very interesting because many people speculated that Confucius wrote the Analects. That was actually not true. The Analects, which is what Lun Yu, which is one of the four books, was actually composed by the disciple of Confucius. So it was a record of Confucius' dialogue with his disciples over issues related to ethics, to politics, to education, even metaphysics. So Confucius himself never wrote any text in the four books, but we often believe he played an important role in editing the Book of Odes, 诗经. So Confucius had a famous line in the Analect saying, 诗300思无邪, which means he basically deleted many erotic poems because originally for the Book of Odes, it contains more than 300 poems. So today, the Book of Odes we have is around 300 poems, but Confucius edited the Book of Odes, which is part of the five classics, and he deleted many poems that he thought were erotic, inappropriate, and contrary to his philosophical belief. We also believe Confucius played an important role in writing chapters in the Book of Changes and 尚书, the Book of Documents, which is also part of the five classics. So I would say Confucius' sayings and his conversation with his disciple was recorded in the Analects. So the Analects is obviously the most important text when it comes to understanding Confucius' core philosophy. But we also need to understand he also played an important role in editing the Book of Odes, 诗经, and also the Book of Documents. So that's, in summary, Confucius' relationship with certain canonical texts. Not with each one of them, but certainly he has a strong associations with the Analects, the Book of Odes, and the Book of Documents.
Now, you've already mentioned the four books and the five classics. Can you explain a bit about how the Chinese classics have been categorized and the reasoning behind those distinctions?
So that will bring me to the next important person in the history of Confucianism, which is Zhu Xi. So he came from the Southern Song dynasty, which is around 800 years ago. And many Western scholars believe he was the founder of Neo-Confucianism. So when you place Neo, Neo before Confucianism, that means the new version of Confucianism. In Chinese, we don't really say Neo-Confucianism. We call it 宋明理学, which means the study of rationality from Song and Ming period, but also means the continuation of Confucianism. Because one thing I need to emphasize is Confucius was the founder of Confucianism, but the school of thoughts developed continuously after the passing of Confucius. And it was only but for a long period of time, it was an important school of thought in the Chinese philosophical tradition. But we have to remember, it was not the dominant school of thought until the Western Han Dynasty, which was around 200 BC, around that period of time. So Confucianism for a long period of time has been a very important philosophical school of thought, but it only became the dominant school of thought in the Western Han Dynasty under Han Wudi, Emperor Wu of Han Dynasty. So he came out with this very important policy called 罢黜百家，独尊儒术, which means only Confucianism now will be respected by the official government, and they will be made into the official ideology of Imperial China. Other school of thought, we can still study them, but they will not be given the same importance as Confucianism. So Zhu Xi, the person I just mentioned, was the inheritor of this intellectual movement. And in the Southern Song dynasty, he wrote the commentary on the four books. So it was actually Zhu Xi who came out with the concept of the four books. because before Zhuxi, we had those texts, but it was never considered as an organic development as the four books. We had the Analects as an independent text. We had the Mencius as an independent text. But Zhuxi believed that nowadays I need to write this commentary on the four books and give these four texts a predominant status within the Confucian classical canon. So he chose the Analects, which is, as I just mentioned, the record of Confucian's saying and dialogue with his disciples. He chose Mencius, which is the dialogue of Mencius, the second most important philosopher in the Confucian tradition. And interestingly, he picked two chapters out of the five classics, which is 大学, the great learning from 礼记, the Book of Rites. The Book of Rites is actually a text, is part of the five classics. But Zhuxi believed that there's two chapters that were so important in this text that he wanted to take them out and wrote a new commentary on them, which is the 大学, the great learning, and 中庸, the doctrine of the mean.
Now, for listeners who might not have ever picked up one of the Chinese classics, who really don't know anything about these books at all, what are they textually? What do they look like? What do they read like?
That's a very good question, Joseph. So I'll just explain in a very concise way. So basically, I would say, let's talk about the four books first. I would say the Analects and Mencius are very similar to Socratic dialogues in the Western tradition or Plato's work. It's mainly dialogues. So Confucius, so the Analects is mainly centered around Confucius' dialogue with his disciples over ethical issues, over issues related to politics, related to governance, related to the Confucian rise, related to education. It also tells you a bit of Confucius' life at different stages of his life journey. So I would say the Analects are more focused on dialogue, which makes it easier to study. Mencius is mainly a collection of Mencius' debates with different scholars around his time, because Mencius came after Confucius. And by the time of Mencius, China was in a military chaotic state, which is the Warring States period. Different states competed with each other militarily, and there was so much brutality and violence in China. Many people died because of the military anarchy in China. So Mencius wanted to use his work, mainly speeches and arguments, to convince certain rulers in China, because China was not unified at the time. So China was separated in different kingdoms. So he approached, for example, the kingdom of the Qi kingdom to convince him to adopt the policy of Confucianism to become a benign ruler. And he argued whoever practiced benevolence would eventually rule over China. Meanwhile, the great learning and the doctrine of the mean are more like philosophical texts, treatises, so more like philosophical treatises. And the great learning gives you the Neo-Confucian's stages of self-cultivation. And finally, the doctrine of the mean, 中庸, the doctrine of the mean, is the most intellectually challenging text out of all Confucian classical canon. Many passages still today can't really be fully deciphered. But basically, you can consider that as the most metaphysical work out of all Confucian texts. And then for the five classics, it's mainly the Book of Odes are related to poetry. They were the record of the earliest poetry from the Western Zhou dynasty. Some of them even dated back to the Shang dynasty, which was around 3,000 years ago. So it was a collection of early Chinese poetry. But given the fact that Confucianism believed the study of poetry and literature had a direct relationship with philosophy and politics, therefore the study of those poems remained important in the Confucian classical tradition. The Book of Changes is mainly about, interestingly, geomancy and fortune telling, and it's also and it's also very philosophical. But actually today, a lot of fortune tellers in China would actually study Book of Changes, 易经. And Book of Documents is mainly Confucius' edition of the sayings of the early Chinese kings. So these are the rulers of China in the Shang dynasty, before the Shang dynasty, in the early Zhou dynasty. It was mainly the study of ancient Chinese politics. And Confucianism believed that the study of ancient Chinese politics would provide wisdoms for today's scholar. And then we have the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is 春秋. That was the study of ancient Chinese history predated Confucius' time, because he believed the study of ancient Chinese history will give us moral guidance in our contemporary world. So for Confucians, the study of history should always be providing moral guidance for future generations. And the last book, the Book of Rites, is mainly the correct behavior that a Confucian scholar must adopt for himself and his family. So that's pretty much a simple explanation of the 4 books and 5 classics. Yeah.
And what sort of period do they date to? How old are they?
All the 4 books, all the 4 books dated back to 2,000 years ago. For the Great Learning and the Doctrine of Mean, most of the philosophical ideas came from author 2,000 years ago. But Zhuxi's commentary 800 years ago gave them new life. It revitalized the text. So for those 2 texts, it's actually important to think about Zhuxi's commentary 800 years ago. Yeah. But like what I just mentioned about the 4 books, Zhuxi's commentary by the time of the Matarichi in China, by the time of Ming Dynasty, Zhuxi's commentary became the orthodox commentary on the study of Confucian canon. For example, if you want to take part in the civil service exam in Ming Dynasty, not only do you need to master the Confucian classical text, you also have to read Zhuxi's commentary, because Zhuxi's commentary were considered as the orthodox explanation on the meaning of those Confucian texts. So when you write your essay in the civil service examination exam, you have to refer to Zhuxi's commentary while writing your essays. So they actually became equally important by the time of Ming Dynasty. So the commentary and the original text.
Can you talk a bit about the way these works have been imperiled over their history? What threats have there been to the Chinese classics, and what works have been lost over history?
I think first of all, there's one question we still need to ask today: is the analects we have today the full records of Confucius saying? Are there any chapter lost? So there's definitely a direct connection between we call that classical philology, which means the study of the transmission of the text, and archaeology. And I think China today, many archaeologists in China are working on royal tombs in the Qin dynasty, in the Han dynasty, even in a Warring States period, because maybe we could find copies of analects before. I have to mention one particular history incident here, which is the first emperor of China and the burning of books. Have you heard about this? Like 焚书坑儒.
It'd be brilliant if you could explain that to the listeners.
Yeah. So basically, by the time of 221 BCE, when China was first unified by Qin Shi Huang, by the emperor, by the king of the Qin dynasty, and he became the first emperor of China, the emperor who built the Great Wall. In order to consolidate his totalitarian control, he burned many books of the Confucian tradition, and he actually killed some Confucian scholar. So that's why for a lot of Chinese archaeologists, it was important for us to excavate royal tombs before the time of the first emperor of China, because maybe we could find a Confucian text, for example, a text of the Analects, before the burning incident. Because after the burning incident, obviously the Confucian corpus survived, but maybe the corpus we have today is a deleted version. Because the first emperor of China and his burning of Confucian books play such a destructive role in the transmission of classical Chinese texts that its impact could never be underestimated. So that's why, in terms of development in Chinese archaeology, many scholars were trying to find Confucian texts before 221 BCE, before the burning incident. And maybe we could find Confucian texts that could give us more materials. But the materials we have today are correct, and they're the best evidence that we have. But I'm not saying they're the perfect example of the Confucian text, just because the burning of the book incident happened in 221 BCE, and that actually caused great destructions on the transmission of Chinese classical canon. So a lot of work today we have, they might be in fragments. They're not the complete text, and we are still looking for the complete text. But that would depend on the development in Chinese archaeology.
Could you give the listeners a sense of the role and importance these classics played in society over Chinese history?
I think the fundamental importance of the Confucian classics is it has played an important role in the education of China, in the education of the Chinese elites for over 2,000 years. So given the fact that Confucianism became the guiding ideology of China since the Western Han Dynasty, the education of China onward after that period has always been using Confucian canon as its basis. And certainly by the time in the Tang Dynasty, when the second emperor of Tang Dynasty, Emperor Taizong, came out with the system of the imperial civil service examination, Confucian Classics became the fundamental text for the training of the Chinese political officials. And therefore, I believe the fundamental importance of Confucian classical canon lies with its direct connections with the Chinese education system. It was only in 1905 when Imperial China, the Qing dynasty, finally decided to abolish the civil service examination system. So that was only in 1905. Before that, the education in China you have were actually 100% centered around the study of Confucian classical canon. So today, the study of Confucian classical canon is no longer the basis of Chinese education system. Because after the May 4th movement in 1919, when the intellectuals, the leading intellectuals in China, desire to make China into a modern state, many people question whether the study of Confucian classical canon was compatible with that ideal. Um, After that particular history development, the importance of Confucianism started to move way for the study of mathematics, sciences, and other disciplines. Because for many Chinese educational scholars, that's what make a country a modern state. When you let your students study modern disciplines as opposed to Confucianism. So today, Confucianism became marginalized, but it still plays an important role when it comes to the training in Chinese language and Chinese literature, just because it has influenced China for 2,000 years. We can never fully take that away from the Chinese education system. Yeah.
And these works, the classics, how did they gain their role in society where people's careers and livelihoods are tied to it? And how did it maintain that position? What was the motivation behind elevating these particular works?
I think a very important part of the fact that people gave such a high importance, a great importance on the study of Confucian classical canon, because those texts actually center around the basis of human life, which is how should we live our life? Why should we be living a noble life? What are some of the choices that we face in life? So actually learning those texts give you practical wisdom. For example, if you are a teacher and you want to know what's the best way to educate your students, reading the Analects actually help you because it demonstrates Confucian's education method with his students. Confucius famously said that for different students with different learning abilities and learning conditions, I come out with different educational strategies. 因材施教. So you should educate someone based on his merits and talents. So you can't just apply a single education method for all students. So actually the study of Confucian texts, in my opinion, provide practical life wisdom and certainly relevance to our life. If you are politicians and you want to know how to govern a country successfully, how to build your trust with the people that you govern, Confucius mentions, they elaborate a lot on that ideas in their works. So I
Hmm.
believe the study of Confucian classical canon actually provide real life wisdom and guidance for our life in the modern world. And that's why I believe those classical texts are still read by Chinese students today. So it provides relevant life wisdom. And when it comes to the self-cultivation in great learning, it actually provides discipline, self-disciplines for students who read them. I personally read the Great Learning for many years, and I think that
Hmm.
has built my own self-discipline. So for
Hmm.
Confucianism, study leads to self-cultivation, and I believe that's still an important concept in today's world. Yeah,
Hmm. I just think it's so interesting that classical, China, Imperial China, they built this examination system and they built it around philosophy and a philosophy that's focused on self-improvement. I think that's one of the things that really makes classical Chinese civilization very unique. I don't think it, and very different to what we expect in modern society. Because obviously China's got the Gaokao system today, but that's very
yeah,
much
Gaga.
focused on
Yeah,
uh, knowledge in the sense of technical knowledge and technical skills. And I think it's
yeah.
really interesting to contrast that with a society where it was built on your understanding of philosophy and your understanding of a philosophy of self-improvement and self-refinement.
Mm, mm, mm. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. I would say the imperial civil system still has a legacy in China today, which is I wouldn't say 高考, but 考公, the civil service examination in China, which basically it's very interesting when you read about Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of modern China, the leader of the 1911 revolution. There are many things he disliked about ancient China, but he talked about that in his 建国方略, his plans for the founding of a new China. He said that there's a very good system in ancient China that I believe should be continued, which is the selection of government examination, the selection of government officials must be based on merit in exams, so 考试. So actually, that's a legacy of the Confucian education system that Confucius famously said 2,000 years ago, 学而优则仕, 仕而优则学. So when you excel in study, maybe you should think about serving your country. Only when you excel in the studies. So that's why Sun Yat-sen said there's one system that we must be adopting in the new China, in the Republic of China, which is the continuation of the system of civil service examination system, that we must assess people who want to serve the public. Civil servants must be selected based on merit in exams. They must demonstrate their merits by taking the civil service exam. So I would say the civil service examination system maybe has more similarity with the 考公, with the civil service examination. Also, examination in China, and I talk about this with many Western friends. I think in today's Chinese society, most people, especially people from humble background, still believe that examination, the test of knowledge and learning, is the most fair, is the fairest way to achieve upper mobility. And that's why that system can still exist in China, because actually most people believe that's the best way for them to move up in the social ladder, is to use exam to show my talents, to show my learning. And that's why most people from ordinary families in China place such an importance in 高考, because I think this should be a consensus in Chinese society that most people believe that 高考 in China today remains the fairest system. No matter what family background you come from, once you show your excellence in exam, you can actually get admitted into a top university in China and fulfill your life potential. So that thinking also comes from Confucianism, that exam, the selection of talents based on exam, is the most equitable and fairest way in a society.
Let's talk about what happened with the Chinese classics as China began to modernize. I understand that you've already mentioned that they were removed from the examination system in 1905. Was there something of a backlash against the classics as China began to modernize?
You asked fundamental questions related to Confucianism in modern China. So let me give you the opinion of some scholars. Some scholars say China was no longer a Confucian society after 1905, because for 2,000 years before 1905, Confucianism played such an important role in every aspect of Chinese society, from education to civil ritual to politics to governance to defense, military, every aspect Confucianism played a role. But once you have removed that from the education system, a clear result would be intellectuals in China lost the pathway to enter civil service. And that has been a problem for China since ancient time. Because Confucianism plays such an important role in guiding the country, most intellectuals dream about entering the civil service, of bringing their knowledge to serve the public. Once you remove that in 1905, intellectuals in China who has devoted his entire life in studying the Confucian classics will no longer have the opportunity to enter civil service. And actually, that's why some historians argue that Qing dynasty eventually collapsed 6 years later, because it has lost the support and hearts of intellectuals from its own domain, because they would argue once you have taken away the civil service pathway from us, there's no reason for us to support you. So we are embracing the revolution in 1911. But after the education reform in 1919, which means Confucianism no longer plays a role in the education of Chinese students, certainly no longer play an important role, many people say Confucianism has lost its basis. 儒学失去了它的靠山. Confucianism has lost its basis. Before that, Confucianism relied heavily on the political mechanism in ancient China, where, as I mentioned, there's a connection between education and politics. After 1905, first they abolished the civil service exam, and after 1919, when they completely removed Confucianism from modern Chinese education system, Confucianism no longer became an ideology, because it could no longer rely on any supporter from the society. But many people also argue, maybe, and I believe in that, maybe that paved a new way for Confucianism. Because I personally believe that the Confucianism from the time of Confucius was fundamentally different to the Confucianism practiced in later imperial China. I personally don't think Confucianism should have a direct relationship with civil service, which brings us to a fundamental questions related to Chinese society. Many modern Chinese scholars, certainly I believe scholars with modern mindset, argue that we cannot equal education with civil service. That would not bring us the best result. We should be, and I think a key feature of modern China and modern Chinese state, whether that's China after 1911 revolution or China after the reform in 1978, is we manage to create multiple pathway for our people to succeed. Because before that, the only way to succeed in imperial China was to take part in the civil service exam and be a government officials. But after 1978, we actually said you could be an entrepreneur, you could be academia, you could be an artist, be a celebrity, be anyone you want to be. And I think that should be the future of a modern China where we give people different pathway to succeed in life. But we can still preserve the good aspect of Confucian ideas in our self-cultivation, in the way we run our relation with others, in the way we govern our families. So I think that should actually, these social changes, these social revolutions would actually usher Confucianism in a new era. And I think that's the only way to bring continuous life, continuous value for the Confucian classics. But we should move away from the old tradition where the study of Confucian texts equals to a career in politics. I think we should move away from that.
Yeah, and so during the 20th century, the people who were coming after the classics and trying to disrupt their position in society, what sort of attacks did those critics make on the classics?
So the criticism was actually related to the point I just mentioned. So Lu Xun famously in the 1919 May 4th movement said, 打倒孔家店. We need to smash the ideology of Confucianism. Because Lu Xun had a famous essay called 孔夫子与中国, Confucius and China. He argued the Confucianism we have today, which means 1919, was not the Confucianism preached by Confucius 2,000 years ago. The image of Confucius today was actually made up by people who want to use Confucius and his ideology to consolidate their own power. So in imperial China, that would be the emperor, the establishment, the political elites. So they wanted to use the Confucian philosophy to brainwash the people, to control them. That's why Lu Xun said, in order to make China truly free, to make Chinese people truly free, we have to liberate ourselves from the barriers of this corrupted Confucian ideas. But he never mentioned that he often, actually Lu Xun gave very high remarks to Confucius. Nobody would disapprove Confucius as a great scholar and the first educator in Chinese tradition. But they criticized the later generation's decision to use Confucianism as a religion, 儒教 as a religion, as an official doctrine to encapsulate the people, to control the people spiritually. And I think that's where a lot of criticism came from. The criticism were not centered around Confucius himself, but mainly centered around the position of Confucianism as a religion, as an official ideology to imprison the people. And I'm actually in favor of the idea that we should separate Confucianism as a philosophy as opposed to a religion. Because by the time of Ming and Qing dynasty, Confucianism actually evolved into more like a religious status. It's almost like a religion where people couldn't really question it. People couldn't really challenge some of its doctrine. And I personally believe that's why China fell behind in many ways in the 19th century. That's why in the 1990 movement, people believe in order to make China a truly modern state, we have to break away with our past. By breaking away with our past doesn't mean that we should completely disapprove Confucius, but we should definitely view Confucius and his philosophy critically. And Lu Xun had a famous concept, which I agree, called 拿来主义, which means we should take what's useful for us by ourselves. We should have the standard in our own hearts. So we should take what's useful from our ancestors by ourselves. So if there are some useful thing from Confucianism, we should use it continuously. But we should definitely break away from the bureaucratic ideas, from the backwardness of its ideology that actually was hindering China's development at that time. I think that has also been the attitude of the new China after 1949, which means we must take ancient China. We must view ancient China critically, and we have to study them. We have to study ancient China continuously, but we have to take the good things from our classics to continually to enrich our country, but we should also be very critical of the backwardness in some of his ideas. For example, the
Mm.
ideas of uh, study is purely for the sake of becoming official. That's a backward idea. And China, the new China has always been very critical of that idea. Yeah.
Mm. Well, let's talk about the second half of the 20th century. How did the Maoist period and the Cultural Revolution affect the position of the classics in Chinese society?
That was actually a very important question, a crucial stage in the history of Confucianism in 20th century China, because Chairman Mao, in the latter part of the Cultural Revolution, came out with this idea. And that's after the fall of Lin Biao, who was his chosen successor in 1969. So the two men broke away with each other in 1971, and Lin Biao eventually died in Inner Mongolia in a plane crash. After that, Mao came with a political revolution called 批林批孔运动, which means the movement on criticizing Lin Biao and Confucius. Because it was actually known that Lin Biao himself revered many ideas of Confucianism and used that to, and then he actually talk about those ideas in many of his political speeches during the Cultural Revolution. So Mao said, now since Lin Biao has proven to be a traitor, we must criticize Lin Biao's ideas alongside Confucian's idea. That actually caused uh, severe destructions of Confucianism in modern China at a state level. Because by that time, if you watch a lot of movies in the 1970s, you read a lot of the political books in that time, Confucius was degraded as a second-class philosopher. And tell you an interesting story. So some people from my parents' generations who were kids in the 1970s, they often refer to Confucius as 孔老二, which is a very degradatory term, because Chairman Mao often said Kong Lao Er is not a great example. And I personally believe some of the criticism were actually legitimized, and that was purely the criticism focusing on that Confucianism for so long have argued continuously that study is for the sake of becoming a bureaucrat. I think that's a backward idea, and that idea was severely criticized during the Cultural Revolution period because during Cultural Revolution, Mao was encouraging people to start rebellions from the bottom and remove officials who were corrupt and who have lost touch with the people. So definitely he wanted to have that revolutionary spirit. So you need to have that revolutionary spirit to crush the burden of Confucianism. So that's actually Mao's ideas, in my opinion, cause destructions on the status of Confucianism in modern China. But I personally believe some of the criticism, as the example I just gave, were actually legitimate. That Confucianism, certainly Confucianism by the time of late imperial China, had many negative thinkings and certainly ideas that were incompatible with the modern China. Purely that idea of
Oh,
study is for the sake of becoming a bureaucrat. I think that idea is very problematic.
so, in contemporary China, what's the
Mm-mm.
position of the classics in the China of 2026?
I think for many parents, there's actually been a revival of the study of Chinese classics because, as I described multiple cases in today's podcast, that the study of Chinese classics train your children as Chinese Mandarin learning ability. So if you master classical Chinese text, it's actually very helpful for you to develop strong abilities in the Chinese language. So there's actually a very useful purpose of studying Chinese classics. But at a state level, which is the most crucial part, um, when we talk about the China dream or we talk about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, a big part of that from an ideological perspective is actually the revival of the good values from the Chinese classics. And because I personally also read a lot about Chinese politics in my spare time, and I can see from the papers of the government or from the report of the party, they've been calling for the revival of the great ideas from Chinese classical civilization. Uh, in Chinese, that's 发扬中华优秀传统文化. So we should continue to develop the treasures from classical Chinese civilization. So I think on a state level, there has been a more encouragement, more incentive for people to learn classical Chinese. And certainly when you look at the design of the Mandarin Chinese curriculum at Chinese state school, there has been a greater emphasis on the study of Chinese classical texts in recent years. So actually, very
Mm.
interestingly, I would say China in 2026 is actually a much better place to study Chinese classics compared to what it used to be 20 years ago. As you know, let's talk about from a geopolitical perspective. As China's power continue to rise and China's GDP, China's military strength continue to rise, there has also been a strong demand for China to export more soft power. And I personally think when it comes to China self-powered, a large part of it will come from the values of traditional Chinese civilization. If you study the Chinese leadership thought on diplomacy, Chinese leadership thought on building a community with shared destiny for mankind, a lot of those ideas actually trace back to Confucian classics. So I would say in the future of China, many of the ideals in Confucian classics will continue to play a very important role in shaping the official ideology of the state. And therefore, in order for us to understand the message behind those policy, we probably have to study Confucian classic ourselves. And I personally find it very easy, for example, from my perspective, to understand the leadership's thinking in China. For example, Chinese leadership thought on diplomacy, on reforms, on governing the state. Because I read a lot of Confucian classics myself, and sometimes when I read a report, I say, that idea came from Confucius, that idea came from Mencius. So you will see the direct connection between the study of Confucian classics and understanding the decision making of Chinese leadership.
Now, can you talk a little bit about how Western readers have approached these classics over the course of European contact with China?
So a large project that they undertook since the time of the Jesuits, who are the people that I look at for my research, was the translation of Confucian classics into Western languages. So the Jesuits initially started translating Confucian classics into Latin, and Matteo Ricci in the late 16th century started the project. But the best version of the translation of Confucian classics actually dated to late 17th century by the French Jesuits, and they composed this text called Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, Confucius, the philosopher of China. And they translated three texts of the four books: the Analects, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean into Latin. And that was brought back to Europe. And that text played a huge importance in the transmission of Chinese classics into Western intellectual landscape, and also caused a huge impact on the thinkers from the Enlightenment period. Because for scholars like Voltaire, Montesquieu, they could use the ideas in Confucian classics to compare with their own political theory. Obviously, they came out with this political theory to say, how could we make France a much democratic, much better state, a freer society? So they could actually use the portrayal of Chinese society in Confucian classics to compare with their model. And China could be a specimen where they could test some of the validity or the applicability of their political theory. So Voltaire himself has been described by many scholars as a Sinophilia, someone who loves China, who appreciates the grandeur of Chinese civilization. Because a very important aspect of Chinese civilization in the European scholars' perspective in the Enlightenment was the fact that academic could enter civil service based on merit, based on exam. And that's something Voltaire spoke very highly of, because he felt at the same time in Europe, intellectuals like him, if he did not have royal patronage, if he did not have the right connections, he would never be able to serve his country. So actually, Western audience, since the Enlightenment time, always a lot of them view Chinese classics from a comparative angle. And because Chinese classics, many of the work, as I just mentioned, trace back to roughly the same period as the composition of many Western texts. For example, Confucius was roughly 100 years before Socrates.
It's really interesting to hear about how, in a period where there's no real sense of there's no exposure to China when those early translations arrived in Europe. No, it's very hard for people to get. It's hard for people today to get a proper understanding of China.
Yes.
It'll be almost impossible to get a proper understanding of China in that period.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to think about how those works were received when you've got like a philosophical text from a completely different and completely unfamiliar philosophical tradition arriving in Europe. How readers and philosophers in Europe would mentally and philosophically respond to that.
Yeah. And I think that idea really traced back to Matteo Ricci, who was the person I look at the most in my research, that he came up with this idea to understand China is to understand its classical canon, is to understand the Confucian classical canon. Because these are the texts, and I'm quoting Ritchie himself in his letter, these are the texts that have shaped China for 3,000 years. And in order for the Jesuits to fully understand China from an intellectual perspective, we must be reading the Chinese classics. And we have to bring those texts back to Europe and let more European audience to understand China from an intellectual perspective. I think that concept, that intellectual project really started from Ritchie. He knew that in order to fully understand China, we have to learn its classics. And that's something he engaged in after his arrival in China. Immediately, he took part in learning the Chinese language, and he hoped to use the learning of Chinese language to help him to master the Chinese classics.
Anyway, if listeners wish to try the Chinese classics, where do you recommend they start?
Start with the Great Learning, because it's just like a program. Because in the Great Learning, they have demonstrate the Confucian's different stages of self-cultivation. So you can start with that, so you know an overview picture of how can Confucianism help you to guide your own life? How do you set up different targets in your life? After that, read the Analects, because that's pretty much the conversation between Confucius and his disciple over different subject matters. And then you can move on to Mencius, because interestingly, the dialogue of Mencius generally are much longer than Analects. Analects seldom have long passages, but in Mencius, you could have a 3 to 4 pages debate in classical Chinese, because Mencius, and this is according to Sima Qian, the historian, 孟子好辩. Mencius loved to debate with other people. Confucius doesn't love to debate with other people, but Mencius was well known for his debating ability and debating talents. So in Mencius, you generally have much longer passages to read and annotate. So I would say start with the Great Learning, move to the Analects, and then Mencius. And finally, you can try to comprehend the deep philosophical message in the Doctrine of the Mean. So I would say follow Zhu Xi's advice. Yeah.
Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation.
That was Peter Xiao. The Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding is a charity which has worked to promote understanding and friendship between the British and Chinese peoples since 1965. If you would like to find out more or get involved, visit sacu.org. If there are any other topics you would like to hear this podcast discuss, or if you have any feedback, please contact us via the email in the show description. The music is Chopin's Grand Vals Brillante, Opus number 18, produced by Gregor Gwendel and released under a Creative Commons license. This podcast was written, produced, and edited by me, Joseph Edmonds. Goodbye.